Right, so thanks for the introduction, Mike, and also Iad and Graham for organizing the event. I think it's a great event. It's a right time to be organizing this event, and I'm glad that we're not letting us stop by a pandemic that happens to drop by. So, as Graham outlined earlier on, in this first session of the day, we're going to try and set the scene of the broader landscape, and then some questions again this broader landscape. So what I'd like to do in my half hour or so is take a somewhat broader perspective, and in this perspective you'll see questions like fairness and bias pop up, but also many other questions, and I'll actually focus for a bit more on transparency rather than fairness and bias. Not because fairness and bias aren't important, but because you're going to get a lot of fairness and bias related work throughout the day today. Right. So part of this is finished work, part of this is ongoing work. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Anna, Boris, Hinda, and Harry. So let's set the scene. As Graham also pointed out, so we've seen a lot of progress in data-driven machine learning-based methods over the last certainly 5 years, facilitating a lot of things that we didn't know were possible as a sort of general citizen and community-facing products. And here we are. So in our own domain in information retrieval, of course, we've seen big leaps, especially the last year and a half, in terms of what neural rankers are able to achieve over and above the old rankers that we know and love and have known and loved for many years. We've seen learn to rank methods coming to really understand individuals really well, creepingly well, maybe for some of us occasionally, based on long-term profiles, but also often based on short-term session-based profiles. We're seeing this in search, in recommendations, in conversational assistance, and we see all of these technologies not just get better, but also getting better at understanding us. And in some degree, to some degree, perhaps, as Graham hinted at, they help us do things we want to do, and they may also be helping us do things that we might want to stop and think about. And so this general question, stop and think about, is a question that pops up all over the place. The concerns with fairness, with accountability of the technology, with confidentiality, with transparency, with safety. Safety for individuals, for groups of individuals, and safety for society as a whole. Now, in response to these concerns, there have been worldwide efforts to formulate now what are good principles that should guide the development of these systems, search systems, recommender systems, conversational systems, AI-based systems in general. So this paper, and I have the references listed at the end, this paper by Jobin et al. Lists some of these efforts and principles, sets of principles that have come up over the last couple of years around the planet, and every part of the planet has come up with principles. I think Jobin et al. List over 50 sets of principles that trustworthy AI-based systems should play by. For us in Europe, this set of principles by the EU high-level expert group, I think they were released in 2018, but work leading up to these principles, I think already started in 15 or 16. That's a very influential set of principles because they guide lawmakers. They also guide funding schemes throughout Europe. And if you take a closer look, you'll see that these principles for trustworthy AI compiled by the high-level expert group can be split up in three groups. Lawful AI principles, ethical AI principles, and robust AI principles. And what I'd like to do is zoom in for a bit on those robustness principles, because I think you'll recognize a lot of things that are immediately relevant to our research and practice. Before I do that, point out that the whole has this guiding principle. It's great to have principles, but they're only a first step. We need instruments, we need mechanisms that actually operationalize these principles. How to do that, this of course is not cut in stone. We don't have the final answers, by no means. So the core message of this talk is take those principles and do stuff with them. Hit the gas with guardrails, but hit the gas. Don't wait until we've thought out all the principles or all the mechanisms. There's only one way ahead here, and that is to learn by doing. And so going back to the principles of the high-level expert group, how do you operationalize those principles? And I'll focus on the robust AI principles that they outlined. And as I said, you'll recognize many of them. So one of the important ones that they mentioned is accuracy. So make sure that systems, predictions, results, outcomes are accurate, that it's well-defined under which conditions they should work, under which conditions you have a certain level of performance, and be transparent about what those conditions are, what the field of usage should be, and where you should definitely not take them. Reliability. So if you have certain performance figures, make sure that these performance figures are the same or roughly the same across different groups in society, across over time, across different individuals, and be very clear about parity, questions of parity with respect to attributes that we find sensitive. It could be gender, race, income, religion, you name it. And of course, much of the fairness and bias questions that we're going to discuss in the course of today are immediately affected by questions about reliability and accuracy. Now, another one that's been gaining a lot of attention and energy also in our community, of course, has to do with repeatability and reproducibility of the results. That has a number of consequences and a number of interesting consequences, not just about sharing code, sharing metrics, but also leaving behind trails. What data did we get? What did we do with the data? How did we clean it up? How did we correct for bias at these different stages? And then a learning mechanism played a role. Which one? And then we select certain results to show to users. Why these? And who decided this? And then there may be other trails around the way of visualizing, the way of presenting. And so repeatability in general is for robust search systems, robust recommenders, robust conversational assistants, has to do with this entire trail, not just the machine learning bit in the middle. Resilience, I think, is another topic that you'll see once you start to unpack this principle of robust AI, resilience to adversarial examples. Assume the worst about the conditions under which your search engine or recommender or conversational assistant has to operate, and then measure how well it does, how good its results, how good its recommendations and answers are. And similarly, the world is not static, users aren't static, the data isn't static. So make sure that your search recommender and conversational system is able to deal with distributional shifts, gradual shifts, certainly, but probably also abrupt shifts that could be due to an event in society or in the world. Make sure you deal with this. Adjust, for instance, your online evaluation method. Adjust the way that you interpret historically collected interaction data to make sure that performance remains accurate, that recommendations remain reliable. And finally, in this list, safety. Safety of users, safety of suppliers, safety of groups that are affected by the results. Privacy preservation is one aspect here, but of course there are many others, and Graham already alluded to some of this in his opening statement. So these are ways of, these 6 dimensions are 6 dimensions that I think we should address when we begin to operationalize this idea of making our systems robust. And for many of these dimensions, we have been working, and some of them for quite a while. Some of you will remember, for instance, the robust track that very much addresses items 1 and 2 here, accuracy and reliability. Reliability, for instance, in terms of our metrics, how much data should we use for determining the ground truth, and how much variance should we expect if we collect less label data rather than more, etc. Now, to me, what is common to all of these dimensions is the idea of transparency. Show what's going on here, explain what's going on here. And so what I'd like to do over the next 10, 15 minutes or so is walk you through this, through some ideas around transparency. I think it's, for us in the information retrieval community, it's a underexplored space, so I'd like to advertise it here today. So let's run. And the story will be very much, or the guiding principle will be very much the same as one that I expressed early on today, and namely do stuff and facilitate others so that they can do stuff. Right. Our communities have recognized this need, this demand for transparency. There's an XAI, Explainable AI community, that has been growing quite rapidly over the past few years, and you're seeing it branch out into lots of different directions. Into our community, Explainable IR, we've been seeing quite a few really interesting contributions over the last couple of conferences. You'll see it, of course, at machine learning conference, but also at conferences like Kai, events like Cheer. Right? What does it mean for systems to be transparent? How do we make them transparent? How do we measure transparency? These are aspects that matter to lots of the communities that I just mentioned. Now, one of the primary contributions so far on transparency is probably this: computational methods that help us understand the prediction of a machine learning method or of an IR method. So these methods help users understand the rationale behind the behavior of a model. why did it generate this prediction, or why did it show this item at the top of the ranked list, or why do I get this basket of recommendations? And techniques roughly can be divided into these two groups: global techniques that explain the entire model. So you have a complex model, and then the explaining model thus operates roughly the same as the complex model, but the explaining model is easier to understand, more intuitively interpretable. And local techniques that don't strive to provide a global explanation for an entire model, but on a case-by-case basis, so individual prediction after individual prediction, try to explain what the model did, what method, and what method is then often translated into which features played a role, which ones were really dominant, which ones did not play a role, but also, for instance, which data instances in our training material played a role here. So those are local techniques, instance by instance. And we've seen in AI in general, but certainly also in the IR community, both in search recommendation and in conversations, quite a few contributions on the global explanations, but even more so on the local explanations. Now, if you look at this work, there's an interesting transparency gap. So there's a lot of work, a lot of really inspiring work. But most of the explanations and explanation methods are geared towards providing explanations to the folks who build, validate, and deploy the models, whether it's in a machine learning model or an IR model, even though there are many, many other stakeholders that play a role. It could be, of course, end users. It could be the lawyers of the company that owns a particular search engine. It could be other decision makers. It could be professionals associated with watchdogs. It could be governmental stakeholders that are keen to check up on fairness, say for suppliers in an e-commerce setting. So surprisingly, most of the work around transparency mechanisms has to do or is catering for the folks who build, validate, and deploy the models, rather than all of these other types of stakeholders. And why is that? Well, many of these transparency methods are these so-called local explanation methods. And they help us, they help machine learning engineers, they help search engineers. But are those really what other stakeholders need in practice? So what I'd like to do is argue that we should be considering offering other types of transparency mechanisms, and I'll give you a few concrete examples later. Transparency methods that look at the behavior of a model under certain conditions, but transparency methods that look at the process that went into building the model, running the model, and presenting the model outcomes. And to me, there are two essential key questions here that we should be thinking about. What types of transparency mechanisms are most appropriate for different stakeholders in different use cases? And assuming we zoom in on a particular use case and a particular stakeholder or type of stakeholder, then how can we evaluate these different transparency mechanisms in objective terms, so that the stakeholder can do what they want to do as well as they should be doing it, and in subjective terms, so how do these transparency mechanisms build trust, build confidence, how do they align with cognitive demands and constraints that those stakeholders might have. So recognize different stakeholders and different use cases, come up with transparency mechanisms for those different stakeholders in their different use cases, and then think about evaluating at least along these two objective and subjective dimensions. So let me list a few use cases for transparency. This is from a paper published at FedStar last year. And then I'll zoom in on one of the use cases. So in this FedStar paper, the following use cases for transparency were mentioned. So first of all, interpreting individual predictions. So provide an understanding of the salient factors for a particular prediction made by a model. And one can think of looking at feature importances, feature selection as one way of catering for this use case, and then typically for a search engineer or a machine learning engineer. Another use case for transparency would be to gain knowledge. So generate new insights about a domain. What are the deciding factors? What are the deciding mechanisms? And what are some of the key properties of underlying data sets and tasks? Supporting decisions. So offer evidence, supporting evidence for a prediction, so that the person who needs to make a decision, whether that's making a purchase, making a hiring decision, making a policy decision, has not just the outcome of our search engine, our recommender or a conversational assistant, but also underlying evidence to support the outcome. More use cases, so suggesting interventions, and that's actually the one I want to zoom in on in a bit. So suggesting interventions is suggest appropriate actions that a stakeholder could take to change the outcomes, to get better outcomes for them for their task. And then, of course, model improvement is another key use case for transparency. Explain what happened, perhaps explain what went wrong, so that different stakeholders can chip in to try and improve a model. Model auditing, audit the search engine that it's safe. In order to be able to do that, audit it so that it's to assure that it's fair. In order to do that, the search engine would need to provide a bit more background. What data did it use to come to these results? How did it weigh in sort of fairness of exposure context? How did it weigh the different qualities of the suppliers whose results you'd like to show, etc. So let me remind you, I'm going to jump into this suggesting interventions use case for the next couple of minutes and show you two examples of some algorithmic work that one can do there. So actionable interpretability, transparency that is aimed at supporting interventions. Right, so this is it. And so first, one very concrete example. This is work that was triggered by a demo that went off the rails. Was a demo of a conversational agent that, as demos have it, went wrong. The conversational agent started producing answers and results that, well, are not fit for human consumption. And so that was painful during the demo, really painful. You have a key stakeholder who comes to look at the demo, and then the bot, the generative model, produces results that really should not be thrown at people. Okay, then what do? Well, in this case, the stakeholder was the machine learning, the search engineer. The problem was that the generative conversational model produced inappropriate content. And then you wonder, where in the training process did things go wrong? What were the training instances that led to this result being generated? And of course, you can do something simple, just leave one out over all of your training instances, and until you're no longer able to generate the inappropriate content that you want to avoid. But we can do better. We can do better in terms of developing methods for recognizing which training instances are important for a particular algorithmic outcome. And there's been a long line of work for this. Our contribution in this paper was to extend that work from neural models to also include tree-based gradient boosting based methods. And what's important to note here is that typically when we think about transparency, we think about the outcome, looking at the outcome of what happened there, but this is really, and then maybe trying to influence the prediction, but this work is really about the step before that, the training phase. The training phase that's often not part of the transparency method. Here it had to be part of the transparency method because that's where things went wrong. That's where the generative model picked up things it should never have picked up. Here's another example, and I'll spend a bit more time on the details here. What's the situation here? Our stakeholder is an end user. The problem is the predictive model produces an outcome that the end user does not like. And what we'd like to do is help the end user do an intervention, change something about the world so that the prediction changes. And so the line of attack here is we're going to generate counterfactual examples that are as close as possible to the real data points, but are counterfactual, so something has changed. And that change indicates how the end user could obtain an alternative outcome of the predictive model. What's important here is that we think these methods that suggest interventions should not decide, should not just say, do this. No, what they should do is offer alternatives. These are ways in which you might be able to change the world to get an outcome that's favorable for you. Now, there's quite a bit of work, very recent work on algorithmic recourse. That is in many ways, much stricter because it says, it tells the end user in many cases what they should do to change the outcome. We have a more open perspective on this. We think we should offer a menu of options and give choice. Also, in many cases, these algorithmic recourse methods, they make assumptions that are very limitative. For instance, that the underlying model is linear or differentiable, or they need some sort of causal structure of the problem space. And in many realistic settings, we don't know the causal structure. Okay. So that's what we want to facilitate interventions. So we have an individual affected by predictions, and our explanation is not just, well, these were the factors that played a role in the decision, but also this is what you should do or could do to have a different outcome. Now, problems in search, recommendation, or conversations where this plays a role is, for instance, in product search, you might want to have a different item ranked at the top. Often that's now in an e-commerce setting, that's often implemented through a business rule. There's the rule that says this item should be placed at rank 1. We think we can do better. In a recommendation setting too, where the outcomes are not what an applicant wants, for instance, in an HR context, or what a hiring agent wants. Again, recommend how these outcomes could be changed. Similarly, in a customer service or help desk environment where we get answers that maybe we don't want. What counterfactual explanations aim to do is not just explain how we got those results, but also how we might get, what needs to be changed to get different results. So we framed the explanation in terms of what input or feature changes are required to change the output, the prediction. And what I'll do over the next few slides to make it super concrete is use a loan application context where a user is denied a loan based on the prediction of a model used by a bank. So that's our setting. We have a user, an end user, has applied for a loan, has entered values for quite a few features that the bank uses to do its prediction, and now doesn't get the desired the outcome that they desire. And a counterfactual example in this case could be something like this: had your income been 1,000 euros higher, you would have been approved for the loan. And so why is this a counterfactual example? Well, it has an important feature, namely income, and it suggests a potential change. Increase your income by 1,000 euros, and then you get a different predictive outcome. So counterfactual explanations are based on these counterfactual examples. So generated instances that are close to the existing instance, but close, but with an alternative prediction. So someone like you, but now with an income that's 1,000 euros higher, that person would have received the loan. And so the difference between the original instance and the counterfactual example, that's the counterfactual explanation. And producing counterfactual examples, well, you can attack that problem as an optimization problem. You find optimal counterfactual explanations. They're optimal in the sense that the changes to the real data points in order to get a different outcome are minimal. And so there was a paper by Wachter et al. Actually in a law journal 3 years ago now that looked at this, generating counterfactual examples and doing this as an optimization problem. We also looked at this, but now not just for differentiable models, but also for tree ensembles. So let me walk you through this and then give you 1 or 2 examples. So the way that we tackled this was given a trained tree-based model, we probabilistically approximate this model by replacing each split in each tree with a sigmoid function centered at the splitting threshold. So you can think of this as you have a tree and a tree, or you have a set of trees, and each node in this tree, hard decisions are made. And what the approximation does intuitively is at each node, we replace the hard decisions by soft decisions with a sigmoid function. Then you get a differentiable version of the model. And there you can find feature values required to get a change, a different outcome using gradient descent. And so in sum, what this method does is approximate a tree, then use gradient descent to find nearby counterfactual examples, nearby as minimal, the perturbation should be as minimal as possible, and then return that example as the explanation. And so what's interesting here is the notion of minimality. It's not uniquely defined. There's a lot of really interesting literature, of course, algorithmic literature, but also cognitive science literature on counterfactual examples, on notions of minimality. And it turns out, and this is a cognitive science publication, it turns out that what people find useful notions or helpful notions or interpretable notions of minimality differs a lot across problem settings and across users. So for some tasks, you want, it's important to make, to change as few features as possible, but then maybe you don't have any restrictions on by which margin you change the feature values. For other tasks, you might want to have small perturbations only, but across many features. And yet for yet other tasks, you might want to take into account the fact that there will be dependencies between the features, and you cannot just change one feature without also affecting the values of other features. And there are interesting distance metrics that, and many of them will be known to you, that actually implement those ideas, that operationalize those ideas. So Euclidean distance metrics minimizes the magnitude of each perturbation. Cosine distance metric minimizes the change in relationship between features. Manhattan distance metric would minimize the proportion of features that are perturbed, so change as few features as possible, but then you might change them, the ones that you do change, by a large margin. And Mahalanobis minimizes the magnitude of each perturbation while also accounting for correlation between the features. And so let me explain that and illustrate that with an example. So again, we have an end user. We're, for the sake of this presentation, we're in a credit risk setting. So we're using a credit risk data set for this, and we have a customer who has been denied a loan. And now a counterfactual explanation could be something like this. Your loan application has been denied. In order to have your loan approved, you need to, and then in this case, two courses of actions: increase external risk estimate score by a certain value, and decrease another feature by a certain value. Now, if you look at the different distance metrics and how they play out in this context, with the counterfactual explanation method that I mentioned on the previous two slides, but then using different distance metrics, you get different menus of options. So Euclidean, cosine, Manhattan, Mahalanobis, and you see interesting differences, right? Manhattan is really different. the suggestions that that come out of the counterfactual explanation generated there make two big changes. One thing should go up, another thing should go down by a lot, and the other features really are not perturbed. In Euclidean, you see a few big changes suggested, increasing some values by quite a bit, decreasing others, but not that many. Cosine tries to preserve the similarity to the original instance by, and that often pans out as making many changes across the board. And the Mahalanobis takes the correlations between the different features into account. And so what you have with these different distance metrics is a menu of options. You want a different outcome? Here are some of the things you might want to consider. So what's the upshot? Looking at explanations as a counterfactual explanation problem, meaning we're trying to get at a suggestion for an intervention that would produce a different outcome. This problem can be solved as an optimization problem. We now have solutions for differentiable models, also for non-differentiable tree-based models, tree ensemble-based models. Some recent work on evaluating these models, or these explanation models, I should say, look at a number of quantitative aspects. So trying to capture minimality in different ways, so closeness to original instances, coverage. Not all of the methods that have been published are actually able to produce counterfactual examples for all data points. And not all methods are able to cope with different sets of metrics, and they may be very inflexible and tied to a single distance metric, and thereby not offer end users all that many options to choose from. Work that still needs to be done here is qualitative evaluation with users. So which of these explanation methods actually helps end users do a successful intervention? What roles do the different distance metrics play? And how useful, how operationalizable for end users are these different notions of minimality? So let's zoom out. What I try to argue for here is transparency plays a role across all the dimensions of robust AI that I mentioned. What we need to think about when we look at transparency is what types of transparency mechanisms are most appropriate for different stakeholders and their different use cases, and how can we evaluate those different types of transparency mechanisms, both in objective terms, so task-based, for instance, but also subjective terms, in terms of, for instance, in terms of trust. So wrapping up, we started out by saying, well, the systems that we build are being used in many, many aspects of life. Graham listed some. They offer great potential to make progress, but they also come with worries. Because of these worries, we've seen sets of principles related to trustworthiness pop up in every part of the world, and in many different organizations. In the EU, these come with principles for robustness. What we should be doing now is taking these principles, turning them into mechanisms, into doing stuff. And I try to explain, to illustrate that in one particular case, namely by looking at explanations and specifically actionable explanations. So what's next? Well, there's a lot more work to do around turning these principles into mechanisms, going from great ideas to stuff that works, stuff that actually helps, stuff that helps different types of stakeholders for different use cases. So if there's one thing that I'd like you to take home from this talk is we have great principles. Now let's do stuff with those principles and make them work. Some references. So here are the a relevant cognitive science publication on counterfactual thinking and how that helps users take actions. The second paper by Jobin et al. Is a very broad survey of different AI guidelines. The third paper here presented at CAI looks at why we want transparency and how there are different flavors of transparency that that are task dependent, use case dependent, and stakeholder dependent. The third publication is on generating counterfactual explanations for non-differentiable models. The fourth is more generally about transparency mechanisms. The final paper here lists identify this problem of finding inferential training samples. The original counterfactual explanation paper on which we built is this one by Wachter et al. As I said, what's interesting about this is it's published in a law journal, and it really sits at the interface of technology development, but also thinking about those developments and coming up with principles guiding those developments. And the last paper here is a paper that argues for what's great to have all those principles for responsible systems, but we should be turning them into mechanisms and instruments. With that, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to take questions you might have.
Well, thank you for this very interesting talk. We have 2 questions in the chat, and I'm just going to read them out in the order of appearance. So the first one is by Jeremy Pickens, and he asks, what seems to be missing from the list of robust AI and transparency is the economic dimension. Can you speak to the notion of multiple actors with divergent economic motivations and how that affects explainable AI and robust AI?
Thanks, Jeremy. Fantastic question. So in general, what you see is you can't have it all. For instance, transparency is great, but of course there's friction with privacy. Similarly, reliability is super important. We give everyone a fair deal, all the stakeholders, certainly in a multi-sided market, for instance. But that may be at the cost to some, right? If in fairness of exposure, we often look at two-sided markets, but actually what we have is a three-sided market. We have consumers, we have suppliers, and we have society sitting in the middle there. Concretely, think back to one of Graham's examples, where society loses if there are increases in what's the word? In opposing views. If we get more radical opponents across a spectrum, society loses. So it may be that the stakeholders win, but society loses. Similarly, in an e-commerce setting, may be great if you can push more products to consumers by more suppliers, but hey, then we have more trucks running around us, driving around our cities and polluting them. And so, yes, the economic dimension is a super important one. It's another dimension on top of the many that need to be taken into account, and you can't have it all. The next one, you highlight the repeatability of results, yet fairness in, say, track fairness is measured by measuring fairness over repeated queries. Does this concern you? Of course, yes, I think, but your point rather has to do with reliability. How do the results that we have generalize to unseen phenomena? I also hear a lot of echo. I see the chat boxes pop up. I also hear a lot of echo. The repeatability is, can we actually, can you repeat my experiment? Can you produce the result that I produced? Can you get the same outcomes with given the audit trail that I hand over to you? So it's not just my code, it's not just my data, but all the other settings. Who made which decisions, which selections across this entire data pipeline? Yes, generalizability obviously matters, but that, in my view, has more to do with the reliability dimension. We have Arjen asking a question. In learning to rank, understanding how to act upon the features identified still seems difficult. Would you agree? Yes. The counterfactual example tells you wrong word in title. Is that actionable? It may be actionable because it may be that the content that you ingest is of too low quality. So then it may trigger an action, namely get your data cleaning and ingestion in order. I'm assuming now we have say a supplier of a service who gets results that they're not happy with. Finding the top ranked results not what they should be. Would you think it makes sense to distinguish in the method between the target audience, developer to fix the system, or the user to understand what went wrong? I think these are all stakeholders that should all be catered for, and we have more. We have regulators in a medical setting. We have a doctor getting results from a system, then needing to decide on a treatment. We have that same person getting results and then needing to explain his or her decision to their patient. So it's not just these different stakeholders, it's also the role and the use case that these stakeholders engage in.